The valley echoed with the thunderous roar of 40,000 Philistine warriors, their bronze armor glinting in the morning sun like scales of a monstrous serpent. At the center of their formation stood a giant so massive that grown men appeared as children in his shadow. Goliath of Gath towered 11 feet above the earth, his spear shaft thick as a weaver's beam, its iron point alone weighing 25 pounds. For 40 days, this champion of darkness had hurled his blasphemous challenge across the valley of Elah, mocking the armies of the living God and daring any Israelite to face him in single combat. The winner would claim victory for his entire nation, while the loser's people would become slaves. Not one Hebrew warrior had stepped forward. Fear had paralyzed the chosen people, and it seemed that all hope was lost. From which country are you watching this video? If you are fascinated by stories of impossible victories and divine intervention that changed the course of history, subscribe to the Biblical Story TV channel and join thousands who discover biblical truths that will transform your understanding of faith and courage. But on this fateful morning, something extraordinary was about to unfold. A teenage shepherd boy was walking through the Israelite camp, carrying nothing more than bread and cheese for his older brothers. His name was David, son of Jesse, and he possessed something that 40,000 trained soldiers lacked: an unshakable faith in the Almighty God of Israel. What happened next would become the most famous underdog story in human history, demonstrating that when God fights for his people, numbers and size become irrelevant. This is not just a tale of a boy defeating a giant. This is the story of how divine power flows through the hearts of those who trust completely in the Lord's strength rather than their own. The sun had barely risen over the hills of Judah when young David began his journey from Bethlehem to the battlefield. His father Jesse had entrusted him with provisions for his 3 eldest sons who served in King Saul's army. Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah had answered the call to defend Israel against the Philistine invasion, leaving David behind to tend the family's flock. For weeks, David had heard disturbing reports about the military situation. The Philistines had assembled their forces at Soko, while Israel had gathered on the opposite side of the valley of Elah. Between these two armies stretched a deep ravine where no battle could be fought, creating a strategic stalemate that favored neither side. As David approached the Israelite encampment, he could hear an ominous sound rolling across the valley like distant thunder. It was not the clash of weapons or the charge of cavalry, but something far more sinister: the voice of Goliath issuing his daily challenge. The giant's words carried supernatural malice, each syllable designed to strike terror into Hebrew hearts and demonstrate the supposed superiority of Philistine gods over the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. David quickened his pace, eager to deliver the food to his brothers and witness firsthand what was causing such distress among God's chosen people. When David reached the battle lines, he was shocked by what he observed. Thousands of Israelite warriors, men who had proven their courage in previous conflicts, stood frozen with fear. Their faces bore expressions of defeat and despair, as if they had already surrendered in their hearts. The atmosphere in the camp was thick with anxiety and shame. These were descendants of the same people who had witnessed the parting of the Red Sea, the fall of Jericho's walls, and countless miraculous victories throughout their history. Yet now they cowered before a single enemy champion, forgetting the awesome power of their covenant with the Almighty. David found his brothers among the ranks and began distributing the provisions his father had sent. As he spoke with them, the familiar sound of Goliath's voice boomed across the valley once again. The giant emerged from the Philistine ranks like a walking fortress, his bronze armor reflecting the sunlight in blinding flashes. His helmet, breastplate, leg armor, and shield created an impenetrable barrier that made him appear invincible. Behind him marched his shield-bearer, a warrior who would have been considered formidable in his own right, but seemed small beside his massive master. Goliath planted his feet at the edge of the ravine and raised his enormous spear toward heaven in a gesture of defiance against the Lord. His voice carried the arrogance of a man who had never known defeat, amplified by supernatural forces that sought to destroy Israel's faith in their God. He shouted across the valley with contempt dripping from every word, challenging the Hebrews to send forth their champion for single combat. He promised that victory in this duel would determine the outcome of the entire war, sparing both armies from massive bloodshed. But his tone made it clear that he considered Hebrew warriors to be cowards, unworthy of his attention. The giant's blasphemous words cut deeper than any sword, He mocked not only Israel's military prowess, but their very identity as God's chosen people. He questioned the power of their invisible deity and boasted that the gods of the Philistines had already guaranteed his victory. With each insult, the Israelite soldiers seemed to shrink further into themselves, their shoulders sagging under the weight of fear and shame. Some began to whisper about retreat, while others stared at the ground to avoid looking at their tormentor. David watched this scene with growing indignation that burned like fire in his young heart. Unlike the veteran warriors around him, he did not see an invincible giant, but rather a mortal man who dared to defy the living God. His shepherd's eyes, trained to spot danger threatening his flock, recognized that this was not merely a military challenge, but a spiritual battle. Goliath was not just representing Philistine military might. He was serving as an instrument of darkness, seeking to prove that pagan gods were superior to the Lord of Israel. This realization filled David with righteous anger that overcame any natural fear he might have felt. As the giant concluded his daily challenge and returned to the Philistine lines, David turned to the soldiers around him with amazement evident in his voice. He asked what reward would be given to the man who killed this uncircumcised Philistine and removed this disgrace from Israel. The word uncircumcised carried profound theological significance, marking Goliath as someone outside the covenant community who had no right to mock the people of God. David's question revealed his perspective. He saw victory as not only possible but inevitable because God's honor was at stake. The soldiers explained that King Saul had promised enormous rewards for the man brave enough to accept Goliath's challenge. The victor would receive great riches, marriage to the king's daughter, and exemption from taxes for his entire family. These incentives represented the highest honors available in Israelite society, yet they had failed to motivate any warrior to step forward. The men spoke of these rewards with wistful longing, as if they were impossible dreams rather than achievable goals. Their tone suggested that they believed no Hebrew fighter could possibly defeat the Philistine champion. David's oldest brother, Eliab, overheard these conversations and became angry with the young shepherd's apparent interest in the situation. Eliab accused David of abandoning his responsibilities with the sheep and coming to the battlefield merely to watch the fighting like a curious spectator. His harsh words revealed the frustration and embarrassment that many Israelites felt about their army's paralysis. Eliab, like his fellow soldiers, had allowed fear to corrupt his faith, and he projected his own sense of inadequacy onto his youngest brother. But David was not deterred by his brother's rebuke. He had not come seeking glory or adventure. He had simply been fulfilling his duty as a son by delivering food to his siblings. However, once he witnessed Goliath's blasphemy firsthand, he could not remain silent. The same heart that had driven him to protect sheep from lions and bears now burned with passion to defend God's honor against this pagan giant. David understood what the experienced warriors had forgotten. Battles are won by the Lord, not by human strength or superior weapons. Word of David's bold question spread quickly through the camp, eventually reaching the ears of King Saul himself. The monarch, desperate for any solution to the crisis that threatened his reign, summoned the young shepherd to his tent. Saul had been the tallest man in Israel when Samuel first anointed him as king, standing head and shoulders above his people. But even this imposing figure felt inadequate when confronted with Goliath's supernatural size and strength. The king, who had once led courageous charges against Israel's enemies, now found himself paralyzed by fear and doubt. When David appeared before the king, his youthful appearance must have been startling. Here was a teenager, probably no more than 17 years old, proposing to face a giant who had terrorized seasoned warriors for more than a month. David's hands were calloused from handling his sling and staff, his skin bronzed by long hours under the sun while watching his father's flocks. He possessed the lean, muscular build of someone accustomed to physical labor. But he hardly looked like a champion, capable of single-handedly determining the fate of nations. King Saul expressed doubt about David's ability to fight against Goliath, pointing out the obvious disparities in age, experience, and physical size. The Philistine champion had been a warrior from his youth, trained in the deadly arts of combat and proven in countless battles. David, by contrast, was merely a shepherd who had never faced an armed opponent in formal combat. The king's concerns were entirely reasonable from a human perspective, but they failed to account for the supernatural dimension of the conflict. David's response revealed the source of his confidence. He told King Saul about his experiences defending his father's sheep against predators that threatened the flock. When lions or bears attacked the animals under his care, David had pursued these dangerous beasts, struck them down with his bare hands, and rescued the sheep from their mouths. If the predators turned to attack him, he seized them by their fur and killed them with decisive blows. These encounters had taught David to rely completely on God's strength rather than his own limited abilities. The young shepherd explained that the same Lord who had delivered him from the claws of lions and the fangs of bears would deliver him from the hand of this uncircumcised Philistine. David's logic was unassailable. If God protected him while he cared for ordinary sheep, surely the Almighty would defend him when he fought for the honor of his chosen people. This was not presumption or youthful bravado. It was mature faith based on repeated experiences of divine intervention. King Saul, moved by David's conviction and desperate for any hope of victory, gave his permission for the young shepherd to face Goliath in single combat. But first, the king insisted that David wear the royal armor for protection. Saul's bronze helmet was placed on David's head, his coat of mail draped over the young man's shoulders, and his sword fastened around David's waist. The king meant well, wanting to provide every possible advantage for this unlikely champion. However, David quickly realized that Saul's armor was more hindrance than help. The bronze helmet obscured his vision, the heavy mail coat restricted his movement, and the unfamiliar sword threw off his balance. David had never worn such equipment or trained in conventional warfare. His strength lay not in conforming to standard military practices, but in utilizing the skills that God had developed in him through years of shepherding. After trying to walk in the cumbersome gear, David respectfully removed all of the armor and weapons, choosing instead to face the giant with only his shepherd's staff, his leather sling, and his unwavering trust in the Lord. This decision shocked everyone who witnessed it. From a tactical standpoint, David's choice seemed like suicide. He was voluntarily giving up every advantage that human wisdom could provide, leaving himself apparently defenseless against a warrior who was armed to the teeth. But David understood something that the onlookers missed. God's strength is made perfect in human weakness. The Lord often chooses to work through unlikely instruments precisely to demonstrate that victory comes from divine power rather than human ability. David walked down to the brook that flowed through the valley of Elah and carefully selected 5 smooth stones from the stream bed. These were not random pebbles, but carefully chosen projectiles, each one evaluated for weight, balance, and aerodynamic properties. David's experienced hands could judge the quality of stones just as a master archer could assess arrows. The number 5 was significant. While David expected to fell Goliath with the first stone, he prepared for the possibility that other Philistine champions might challenge him, or that Goliath himself might prove more resilient than anticipated. As David approached the battlefield with his simple shepherd's equipment, both armies watched in stunned silence. The Israelites were torn between admiration for his courage and horror at what seemed like certain death for their young hero. The Philistines began to laugh and jeer, viewing David's appearance as confirmation of Hebrew cowardice. If this boy was the best champion Israel could produce, their victory would be swift and decisive. But neither army fully understood that they were about to witness a demonstration of divine power that would echo through history. Goliath emerged from the Philistine ranks to meet his challenger, his massive frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the smaller figure approaching him. As the giant drew closer, the true scale of David's task became apparent. Goliath's bronze armor gleamed like the scales of a dragon, and his spear point caught the sunlight like a deadly star. His shield-bearer marched beside him, ready to provide additional protection for his master during the combat. The giant's face bore an expression of amused contempt, as if he were about to squash an irritating insect rather than fight a worthy opponent. When Goliath saw David clearly, his amusement turned to indignation and rage. The Philistine champion felt insulted that the Israelites had sent a mere boy to face him instead of a proper warrior. He cursed David by his gods, invoking the names of Dagon and other Philistine deities to bring destruction upon the young shepherd. Goliath's words carried not just human anger, but supernatural malice, as demonic forces sought to intimidate David and shake his faith in the moments before battle. The giant mocked David's youthful appearance and simple weapons, asking if the Israelites considered him no more threatening than a wild dog to be driven away with sticks. Goliath promised to feed David's flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field, a fate considered especially horrible in ancient times because it prevented proper burial. The giant's threats were designed to paralyze David with terror and demonstrate Philistine superiority to both armies watching the confrontation. But David's response revealed the spiritual nature of the conflict and the source of his unshakable confidence. He told Goliath that while the Philistine came against him with sword, spear, and shield, he came in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom Goliath had defied. David's words rang across the valley with prophetic authority, declaring that this day the Lord would deliver the giant into his hands. He promised that he would strike down Goliath and cut off his head, then give the dead bodies of the Philistine army to the birds and wild animals. David's bold declaration served a purpose far beyond mere boasting. He proclaimed that this victory would demonstrate to all the earth that there is a God in Israel, and that all assembled would learn that the Lord saves not with sword and spear but by his own power. The battle's outcome would vindicate God's reputation and prove that he fights for his people regardless of seemingly impossible odds. David understood that he was not merely fighting for Israel's freedom, but for the honor of God's name among the nations. The two combatants began to move toward each other across the valley floor, their footsteps marking the approach of one of history's most decisive moments. Goliath advanced with the confidence of a predator approaching helpless prey, his massive stride covering ground quickly despite his enormous size. His bronze armor clanked rhythmically with each step, creating an intimidating sound that had struck fear into countless enemies over the years. The giant's spear was poised for a killing thrust that would end the fight in a single devastating blow. David ran toward Goliath with the swift, purposeful movement of a shepherd protecting his flock from a dangerous predator. As he sprinted across the battlefield, he reached into his shepherd's bag and selected one of the smooth stones he had gathered from the brook. His practiced hands loaded the stone into his leather sling with movements so natural they seemed effortless. Years of protecting sheep had honed David's accuracy to an extraordinary degree. He could hit targets at distances that would challenge even experienced soldiers. The critical moment arrived when David came within range of his opponent. Goliath raised his massive spear, preparing to hurl it at the approaching youth with enough force to pierce any armor and pin his victim to the ground. The giant's shield-bearer stood ready to protect his master from any counterattack, though neither Philistine expected David to survive long enough to mount one. The entire valley fell silent, except for the sound of the combatants' breathing and the rustle of David's sling as he began to whirl it overhead. David's sling became a blur of motion as he spun it with practiced skill, building momentum and calculating trajectory with the instinctive precision of a master marksman. The leather weapon was not a child's toy, but a formidable military instrument capable of propelling stones with deadly velocity and accuracy. Skilled slingers were valued warriors in ancient armies, able to strike targets at remarkable distances and penetrate armor that could deflect arrows. In David's hands, guided by divine providence, the humble sling became an instrument of God's judgment. At the perfect moment, David released the stone with a smooth, powerful motion that sent it flying toward Goliath with supernatural accuracy. The projectile traveled faster than the human eye could follow, tracing a deadly arc through the morning air. Goliath had only an instant to realize his danger before the stone struck him in the forehead with a sound like thunder. The impact was so powerful that it penetrated the giant's skull and drove deep into his brain, killing him instantly and fulfilling David's prophetic declaration. Goliath's massive body swayed for a moment like a great tree beginning to fall, then crashed to the earth with an impact that shook the ground beneath the feet of both armies. The champion who had terrorized Israel for 40 days lay motionless in the dust, his bronze armor now serving as his funeral garment. The stone that had felled him remained embedded in his forehead, a visible sign of God's power manifested through the faith of a shepherd boy. In an instant, the entire strategic situation had been reversed, and the supposedly invincible Philistine lay dead before the armies of the living God. David ran to where Goliath had fallen and stood over the giant's lifeless form, claiming the victory that belonged to the Lord. Since he carried no sword of his own, David drew Goliath's massive weapon from its sheath and used it to cut off the giant's head, completing the execution he had promised. The sight of their champion's severed head, held high by a Hebrew youth, sent shockwaves through the Philistine ranks. shattering their confidence and fulfilling the terms of the combat challenge. The psychological impact on both armies was immediate and dramatic. The Israelites, who had cowered in fear for more than a month, suddenly erupted in victorious shouts that echoed across the hills of Judah. Their faith in God was instantly restored, and they remembered their identity as the people chosen by the Almighty to accomplish His purposes on earth. The same warriors who had been paralyzed by terror now burned with righteous anger against the enemies who had blasphemed their God and threatened their families. Meanwhile, the Philistine army experienced the opposite transformation. Their confidence evaporated like morning mist, replaced by superstitious dread and growing panic. The death of their champion proved that their gods were powerless against the God of Israel, leaving them exposed to divine judgment without supernatural protection. What had begun as a routine military campaign to expand Philistine territory suddenly became a fight for survival against a people whose God fought for them in miraculous ways. The Philistines began to retreat in disorder, abandoning their carefully prepared positions and fleeing toward their coastal cities. Their organized formations dissolved into chaos as panic spread through their ranks like wildfire. Warriors who had confidently anticipated victory now threw aside weapons and armor to run faster from the pursuing Israelites. The retreat quickly became a rout as divine terror fell upon God's enemies, completing the judgment that had begun with Goliath's death. King Saul and his army pursued the fleeing Philistines with righteous fury, striking down enemies and recovering spoils all the way to the gates of Ekron and Gath. The Israelites plundered the abandoned Philistine camp, seizing weapons, gold, silver, and other valuables that their enemies had left behind in their haste to escape. This unexpected wealth would help fund future military campaigns and demonstrate God's provision for His faithful people. The road from the valley of Elah to the Philistine border became littered with evidence of divine judgment upon those who defied the Lord. David kept Goliath's armor as a trophy of God's victory, later dedicating these spoils in the tabernacle as an offering of thanksgiving. The giant's sword became a sacred relic that would later serve David again in times of need, reminding him of the Lord's faithfulness when circumstances seemed impossible. But more importantly, David's victory established his reputation throughout Israel as a man after God's own heart, someone who trusted completely in divine power rather than human strength. Word of the miraculous victory spread rapidly throughout the ancient world, carrying news of the God of Israel's power to distant nations. Kings and generals who had never heard of the Hebrews suddenly became aware that this small nation possessed supernatural assistance in warfare. The story of David and Goliath became a declaration to all peoples that the Lord reigns supreme over human affairs and defends those who trust in His promises. No earthly power, regardless of size or strength, could stand against the Almighty when He chose to act on behalf of His covenant people. The theological implications of David's victory extended far beyond military success. This confrontation demonstrated fundamental truths about faith, courage, and divine sovereignty that apply to believers in every generation. David's willingness to face Goliath with only a sling showed that God often chooses weak instruments to accomplish great things, confounding human wisdom and revealing His glory. The young shepherd's confidence came not from his own abilities, but from his relationship with the Lord and his understanding of God's character. David's victory also prefigured the ultimate triumph of good over evil that would be accomplished through another son of Jesse many centuries later. Jesus Christ, descended from David's line, would face an even greater giant in the form of sin, death, and Satan himself. Like David, Jesus would achieve victory not through conventional weapons, but through apparent weakness and humiliation. The cross, like David's sling, seemed inadequate to accomplish its purpose, yet it became the instrument through which divine power conquered humanity's greatest enemies. The story reveals that spiritual battles require spiritual weapons and spiritual faith. David succeeded where trained warriors failed because he understood the true nature of the conflict. Goliath represented more than Philistine military might. He embodied the forces of darkness that seek to oppose God's purposes in the world. Victory over such enemies requires more than human courage or superior equipment. It demands complete trust in God's power and willingness to act according to His will, rather than conventional wisdom. David's example encourages believers facing seemingly impossible situations to remember that God specializes in overturning human calculations and expectations. The Lord delights in using unlikely instruments to accomplish his purposes, often choosing the weak to shame the strong and the foolish to confound the wise. When God's people face overwhelming odds, they can take courage from David's example and trust that the same God who delivered the shepherd boy will deliver them according to his perfect timing and methods. The account also demonstrates the importance of preparation and faithful service in ordinary circumstances. David's ability to defeat Goliath resulted from years of training while protecting his father's sheep. His accuracy with a sling, his courage in facing predators, and his intimate knowledge of God's protective power all developed during routine shepherding duties. The Lord used these humble experiences to prepare David for a moment that would determine the fate of nations, showing that no act of faithful service is insignificant in God's economy. Furthermore, David's victory illustrates the power of proper perspective when confronting life's challenges. While others saw Goliath as an invincible opponent, David recognized him as an obstacle that God would remove to fulfill his purposes for Israel. The young shepherd's faith enabled him to see the situation through divine eyes rather than human limitations. This spiritual insight gave him confidence to act boldly when others were paralyzed by fear, demonstrating that faith transforms both perception and performance. The lasting impact of David's triumph over Goliath continues to inspire people facing overwhelming challenges in their personal lives, careers, health battles, and spiritual struggles. The story reminds us that no giant is too large for God to handle, and no situation is beyond his power to transform. When believers approach difficulties with David's faith and dependence on divine strength, they position themselves to experience miracles that glorify God and encourage others who face similar battles. This ancient account from the Valley of Elah remains one of history's most powerful demonstrations that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they trust completely in God's power and purpose. David's courage in facing Goliath, with only a sling and 5 smooth stones, proves that divine strength accomplishes what human ability cannot, and that faith in the living God can overcome any obstacle that stands in the way of his will. The young shepherd's victory continues to echo through the ages, calling every generation to trust in the Lord with all their heart and lean not on their own understanding, knowing that he will direct their paths to victory over every giant they face.